police in Las Vegas found themselves in the middle of a UFO mystery last month after
To us. Big eyes, they have big eyes.
911, what are you reporting?
We got someone or something crawling around out here.
Did you see what it was? Was it a person or an animal? Or?
One of my partners said they saw something fall out of the sky too, so that's why I'm kind of curious.
What sign? I don't know.
Do you see him now, sir?
Yes, I'm looking right at him.
Okay, hang on.
He's right.
Is he in your yard, sir?
Yeah, God, he's big.
Okay, what's he doing in your yard?
Mythical Legends Podcast with your host Daniel Barnett.
Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Mythical Legends Podcast. As usual, I have my dad Craig with us. Hi Dad.
Hiya Daniel, how you doing, mate? You alright?
Yep, good. And I also have my granddad, who got me interested in this mystery of Bigfoot. Adrian Roberts has joined us to talk with our special guest today. Hi Gramps.
Hello Daniel, how are you? Hello
Yeah.
Dr Meldrum. It really is quite an honour to speak to you. I never thought this would happen, and I'm looking forward to a really good conversation.
Oh great, I am as well. Thank you.
Amazing. So, today, our amazing guest, a professor in anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, author of a book called Sasquatch Legends Meet Science in 2006, and many more. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum. Thank you for spending time with me today, Dr. Meldrum. How are you?
I'm good. Beautiful summer day.
Where are you based?
I am in Pocatello, Idaho, which is in the northern Rocky Mountains. We're down in the southeastern corner of the state, and a beautiful area, just a few hours away from Yellowstone National Park, the Grand Tetons, Craters of the Moon, a lot of beautiful scenic sites and wonders, geologic wonders in this area of the country.
Sounds beautiful. So could you tell our listeners about how you got interested in Bigfoot and a little bit about yourself?
Well, sure. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. In my grade school years were in Spokane, Washington. And it just happened. I mean, as a kid, I was always fascinated with natural history. I had my insect collections, always bringing stray animals home, and terrariums and aquariums lining the bookshelves in our room and so forth. It happened that in 1968, Roger Patterson came to Spokane to show his now famous film clip, a documentary actually that featured that film clip, shot down in the wilderness of Northern California the previous year. This was one of the first public showings of that film. It had been reviewed by a scientific panel both in Canada as well as at the Smithsonian in the United States. But then he went on a public showing tour, and so I, when learning of this through my friends and through the newspaper adverts, I convinced my dad he needed to take me and my younger brother down to see this. And so we were there on the third row in the Spokane Coliseum, and it was amazing. It was just, it embodied, at that time I was about 11 years old, and it embodied all these different topics that I was interested in prehistoric man and evolution and primates and all the aspects of their natural history. So that set the ball in motion. I mean, I was just captivated and really dug into the topic. I scoured the libraries for other reading materials, sources. Of course, a lot of things relating to the phenomenon of the Yeti in the Himalayas sort of predated Bigfoot. And while there wasn't a lot of published material on Bigfoot, there was a lot of source material for the legends surrounding Yeti, and it was interesting to compare and contrast the similarities and differences between the reports of these two mystery primates. And over the years, that interest waxed and waned. I mean, it kind of synergized a lot of my fascination with physical anthropology and paleoanthropology, human evolution. And eventually I ended up pursuing a career along those lines with an emphasis in the anatomical sciences, the physical anthropology aspects. And I was interested in this unusual habit of walking on two legs, this adaptation to bipedalism that we seem to share with Bigfoot. And although Bigfoot was way on the back shelf at this stage, but then several things happened that put me in a position to offer some expertise to evaluate some possible evidence. I was asked to look at a piece of video footage that had been shot down in Northern California as well, closer over to the coast of Northern California. And it was an interesting piece of video that I undertook the exercise as one of simply pointing out the zipper, so to speak. You know, I would just apply my understanding of anatomy and human and non-human primate locomotion and point out how this was probably a hoax. I mean, at this stage, the interest in Bigfoot was rather latent, and so much time had elapsed. I was rather skeptical, you know, having been trained in the kind of more conventional paradigms of anthropology. It seemed unlikely that so much time would have elapsed since that iconic film by Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin without any resolution having been reached, that it probably was more likely just a bunch of stories. But as I worked with this piece of footage, there were all sorts of interesting little tidbits in the anatomy that as poor as the quality of video imagery was and the conditions of recording, it still had some interesting little clues, and I honestly couldn't find the zipper. And I'm thinking, maybe there is something to this, and was quite intrigued. That set several other events in motion, and I ended up visiting Dr. Grover Krantz, a now deceased physical anthropologist, formerly at Washington State University, who was one of the few outspoken anthropologists willing to tackle this controversial subject, despite the negative consequences for his professional career. And I always admired him for that, and I, as it turned out, was able to go up along with my brother on a little road trip to visit him in his lab and see some of the footprint evidence that he had accumulated over the prior decades. That really intrigued me because, footprints, the evidence of bipedalism in the fossil record, the correlated anatomy and for terrestrial walking and bipedal walking and so forth. That was my expertise. That is where I had concentrated my studies. And so I was able to look at these footprints with a much more informed and critical eye, and was, all the more impressed by it. Then what really set the hook was, as my brother and I were returning from this visit, we decided to pay a little surprise visit to the very people who had found some of those footprints that Dr. Krantz had in his collection, and that I had read about in other books that had been recommended to me that had recently been published. One particularly from southeastern Washington, from the Blue Mountains outside of Walla Walla. And to make a long story short, it's already long, but to keep it shorter.
That's all right.
The person that I paid this surprise visit to, one of the key figures in the amateur search for evidence, was a man named Paul Freeman, and we literally showed up on his doorstep that Sunday morning. And as it turned out, he had just been up in the foothills. This was in February of 1996. The snows had it had warmed up a little bit, and the snows had melted back from the foothills, exposing some of these dirt roads, which made excellent tracking surfaces, And so he would make a habit of running these dirt roads in his pickup truck for looking for any sign, any early sign of activity of the Sasquatch, taking advantage of the exposed resources, the greening up belt, and there were abandoned fruit orchards in the foothills and fallow fields that grain heads could be gleaned from, and so on. And he, after very cordially and graciously inviting us into his home and seeing some of the original casts that he had collected, there's something about the originals. They have a certain, I don't know what it is, but there's a certain quality to the original casts that you don't quite capture in the replicas. There's certain details that are muted and so forth, but there's also it's a rather subjective quality, I guess, of animation in an original cast. And so to see these originals laid out across the floor, the carpeted floor of his den, was just amazing. It was just stunning. And I was asking him all kinds of questions, and he then responds, "Well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see some fresh tracks?" And my jaw just kind of slacked, and I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, when you pulled up, I was just coming back from a quick run through the foothills, and sure enough, I found the first evidence of tracks for this year, just up, in the boundary with forest." And I was rather, incredulous, but I thought, well, what have we got to lose? Here we are. Let's take a look. So we went up, and here was this long line. It must have been 35, 45 absolutely clear tracks in the mud of this farm access road off of one of the tertiary dirt roads, and
Wow.
the tracks were just clear. I mean, the weather was a bit overcast and drizzly rain. Of course, the ground was still quite moist from the snows having just recently receded, and the soil in this part of the state is very, very clay, very high in this glacial loess, very fine sediment that picks up remarkable detail and footprints under the right conditions. And there were, so much detail. As I knelt down by some of these tracks, you could actually see the skin pattern, the dermal ridges from the sole of the foot in the mud. And, even talking about it now, the hair stands up on my arms and the back of my neck, because I suddenly had this epiphany, or this experience of this sensation of, they do exist. The Sasquatch just walked by here last night, and it floored me. And because I was keeping kind of an open mind, a curious mind, but rather skeptical up to this point, rather trying to be objective and critical of the evidence, and boy, this just blew away any pretense that this was a hoax in my mind. I mean, not only those kinds of details, but obviously the dynamics, the variation. We weren't looking at just one footprint, but a series. You could see the movement of the toes, the splaying, the flexing. You could see the sliding. There were some where the toes, where there was a slight incline, the foot had slid in the mud, and the toes had sharply curled, and mud extruded up between the toes as the toe pads, really dug in to gain a purchase. And there were half tracks where it was running up on the front half of its foot. I think it had been surprised by a vehicle coming down. The tracks were so fresh, they had to have been laid down in the wee hours of that very morning or the late that previous night. And I think being a Saturday night, on the first weekend that you could actually drive on those roads because of the melting, I suspect there was someone, up on the ridge and to just drive around or maybe have a bonfire, who knows what. And we're returning and caught this Sasquatch out in the open, and it did a hairpin turn and started walking. You could actually see as it looked over its shoulder, as it was retreating, the right foot would angle out at 45 degrees. And then apparently it felt the need to get under cover, and it took off running. The stride doubled in length. The track shortened to these half tracks where the heel was up in the air as it was running on the forefoot. I mean, the story was to be read. It was there if you knew what you were looking at, of what had transpired, what had likely transpired, and I was just flabbergasted. I mean, it was so. Anyway, that set things in motion. We eventually took Paul Freeman back to his home, and I turned to my brother and I said, "Look, even if these are hoaxed, what a fantastic opportunity! It's not often that you hear about long lines of tracks like this to document a case study. Even if it's the anatomy of a hoax as opposed to actual evidence of Sasquatch." Now I'm quite convinced it's the latter, not the former, and for all the reasons that have become all too clear and have found repetition in multiple subsequent examples that I've either found myself or have examined evidence of discovered by other people. So we quickly found a store that had plaster, went back up, and really studied the scene again, repeating our observations, and made a series of representative castings of various footprints to capture some of the variation that was clearly seen. Now, 8-9 years later, I've got 300 plus footprint casts in my laboratory that have corroborated, validated some of those initial observations, refined them, and from that has emerged a model of the Sasquatch foot that is not only remarkably coherent, internally coherent, mechanically, the proportions and so forth, the function, but also it's an elegant adaptation for a large, heavy bipedal hominoid navigating steep, irregular terrain of mountainous forest habitat. So it's really quite amazing. Anyway, let you interject your specific questions.
Hi, Dr. Meldrum. Hi, can I just butt in a second? This is Adrian. I'm Daniel's granddad.
Yes.
Thanks again for talking to us. You've just preempted actually some of the questions I was really interested in asking you, particularly about the footprints. I've listened to you several times on various National Geographic channels, etc., about your collection of footprints. Right. Which seems to be absolutely phenomenal. Do you think that at the moment that is the best evidence we have of a large bipedal creature of Sasquatch, in the absence of other sort of evidence? Is the footprints that you've collected the sort of gold standard of evidence at the moment?
I think it is, because the only thing that could get even better, and on par with that, quite honestly, because I'm quite convinced of its credibility, is the Patterson-Gimlin film. That has set the bar as far as photographic evidence, but in terms of trace evidence, it's the footprints that are hard to deny, unless you are unless you adopt just a very ignorant posture, an attitude towards them. I'm working on a paper right now that's a response to a skeptical little piece that appeared in a digital newsletter of a granting agency, and the contributing op-ed, the writer of the op-ed, he takes exception to the evidence. I mean, he from the outset of his piece, asserts this is all just a hoax after all, And so as such, people who adopt that posture, they seem to feel no compunction to account for the evidence. Why bother? They seem to say, if it's a hoax. So basically, most of their writing is about the people, about their personality shortcomings, about some of the antics of the non-professionals. They don't grapple with, they cannot, most of them don't have the training or expertise to do it anyway. But when you look at those scientists who have taken this topic much more seriously, Dr. John Napier and Dr. Grover Krantz, for example, it was the footprints that really convinced them. That was the key thing. And myself, similarly, Dr. John Bindernagel was also very impressed by the footprints. So yes, I think it is. I mean, these are not just simply enlarged facsimiles of human footprints. They are distinct in their proportions and in their architecture of the skeletal adaptations. They are flat, flexible feet. It actually embodies what we now, decades later, have come to recognize as the adaptations associated with early bipedalism in hominids, before the modern foot form with its very gracile, very narrow, tapered foot skeleton and arched foot and shortened toes. Before that emerged, this was the strategy. The early Australopithecines walked on flat, flexible feet, and some of their footprints show dynamic artifacts or features that are remarkably reminiscent of indications in the Sasquatch foot. And that's what's really gotten me. I mean, I've had the advantage, given the length of time I have been involved with this topic, and having come on it sort of as the second or third generation of researchers, you might say. So coming in after there already were several decades of accumulated evidence, we can see how footprints that were described and were documented as casts clear back in the 1950s and 60s predate our current understanding of hominin bipedal evolution, which really didn't take shape until after the discovery of the very famous Laetoli tracks, the Australopithecine tracks in East Africa that date back to about 3.5 million years, but they weren't discovered until the mid-70s. And so I find it fascinating that tracks that were displayed back in the 50s, that first Bigfoot in 1958 that Jerry Crew.
Is that Jerry Crew? Yeah.
Jerry Crew exhibited. Here's a little interesting historical aside that your listeners may not be aware of unless they've seen one of my presentations where I highlight it. I haven't published it as per se, but one of the things that has really caught my attention, that one of the contributions I've made, is the description of the definition of this mid-tarsal break as it relates to the Bigfoot tracks. And one that really exemplifies that really brought it to mind. Well, it was actually these tracks that I saw in 1996. One of the things that jumped out at me was examples from this trackway, including the half tracks, but that showed this mid-tarsal pressure ridge in this soft soil, and that was indicative of a flat, flexible foot with a great deal of range of motion through the midfoot joints, which have been greatly limited in their movement and stabilized in the human foot in order to support the longitudinal arch. Well, what's interesting is I've had the opportunity to visit with Jerry Crew's son, John, who is of the brothers, is the custodian of the original cast that Jerry Crew made in 1958. And the picture everyone sees is a newsprint photo where the photographer used, one of those old journalist cameras with a very intense flash. And as such, I mean, you see this really stark shadow behind Jerry on the wall. When you use a flash like that, it tends to kind of flatten out the topography. Everything looks like it's a flat poster board or something. Yeah. Well, I had the chance to actually look at the cast in real first person, and guess what? It has a pressure ridge, just like the tracks from the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Wow,
that's unbelievable.
Yeah, I saw that, and so we've got this anatomy and this adaptation. If it were hoaxed, why would anyone introduce some feature like that? And what would be the motivation? What would be the basis? No one had a clue that that was a characteristic of some of the early tracks attributed to Australopithecines, that the foot skeletons, the fossil foot skeletons that were discovered, exhibited a much greater range of motion, that they probably walked with a mid-tarsal brake, just like has been described for chimpanzees, for example, when they're walking on the ground. And the same can be done for the Patterson-Gimlin film. When I talk about that in public, it's really interesting to take a retrospective and say, okay, looking back now after 50 years plus that film has been around, how do you account for features, unusual novel features and combinations, correlated combinations of features, even more complex, take it the next order of complexity, that in 1967, 68 were presumed to be counterintuitive, that were cutting against the grain or contradicted what was conventional wisdom at the time. One of my favorites was John Napier, British primatologist at the Smithsonian. He was on the panel at the time that the Patterson-Gimlin film was reviewed. He was clearly impressed enough by the topic and had harbored already interest in the Yeti question. He wrote one of the first academic books addressing this. And then in the book, he said, I really can't put my finger on my rejection of the Patterson-Gimlin film. The one thing that stands out, though, is that when I look at that film, I see a combination of traits. I see from the waist up something that looks essentially like an ape, but from the waist down has the anatomy of a biped, of a hominid biped. And he said, I can't. It's inconceivable to me that such a hybrid of structure could exist in nature. That combination wasn't part of the conventional wisdom of the time. Well, it's interesting because his book came out in 1972. Later in the 70s, as I pointed out, the skeletal remains of Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, were discovered in East Africa about the same time as the Laetoli footprints were coming on the scene. And for the first time now, we had skeletal remains to go with the jaws and teeth and crania. And how did they describe these discoveries to the popular press? From the waist up, isn't this interesting? From the waist up, she looks like a chimpanzee, but from the waist down, she has the hips and knees and ankles of a human-like creature. What an interesting combination of traits. Well, wait a minute, that was the linchpin for Napier's rejection of the Patterson-Gimlin film.
Yeah.
The only thing he could draw criticism to, and yet the criticism was based on an antiquated view of the pattern and process of the combination of traits exhibited in early hominin ancestors of humans. So again, the film anticipated our current understanding, and it's spot on. Every objection that was raised by the so-called experts at the time has been refuted ultimately. And in fact, what you see on that film is exactly how we might, with the exception of the gigantic size, is exactly how we might envision early bipedal hominins.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Dr. Meldrum. The Patterson-Gimlin film is one of the catalysts that actually got me interested back in the late 60s. And it still remains, as you say, that the most famous photographic evidence to date, and that's only reinforced, I think, by Bob Gimlin's continued stance in standing by his story in the face of much antagonism, I would say, over the years. Yet his story has never ever varied, right from day one right up until now, and that to me says something about the man and the film itself. Well, what I would like to just go on from there very briefly is the given the huge advances in sort of technology since 1967, why do you think that remains the most convincing piece of film that there is? Is it something that as the creatures become more intelligent and sort of better at avoiding us, or why isn't there a bit more photographic evidence that that could move matters on a bit, if you see what I mean?
I do. I think some of it boils down to, lightning rarely strikes twice, and given the rarity of these creatures, with a very sparse population numbers, contacts, reliable, corroborated, substantiated encounters, and the corroborating evidence is really pretty rare, and as such, even though there's been a proliferation of iPhones and handheld camera equipment and so forth, not only are the encounters rare, but they are notoriously brief, fleeting. And I think a lot of people just don't have the composure to capture on camera their
I'd agree with that.
A lot of the imagery that we get are kind of photobomb circumstances where they're actually taking a picture of something else and then happen to notice, sometimes after the fact, that there was something in the background. There was, and I don't know if it's still there, I haven't looked for a while, but on Facebook there was a Facebook site a gentleman maintained called Facebook Find Bigfoot, and FBFB, and what he would do is solicit people to submit to his site their little piece of footage or frame or image or whatever, and then he would evaluate these, and as this went on, he developed sort of a set of criteria by which he ranked these images that came to his attention. Now, any one taken by itself was, with a few exceptions, or any one was not very compelling. But what was fascinating is when he put together like his top 20 based on his ranking, which had to do with circumstances and visibility and particular traits that he was looking for, that he sort of established as tells or features, consistent features. You would get little snippets here, little snippets there, any one of which by itself was not that convincing. But when you started to consider this series, then there was remarkable consistency, remarkable repetition of some of these distinguishing characteristics that made you really start to take note. But the Patterson-Gimlin film set the bar so high that everything else is falls into question. And plus, it's been, honestly, when I first I was very late to actually own an iPhone, for example. I was kind of slow to really take advantage of some of the social media as a means to communicate with other people. And so as an old dog, I would wonder, well, why, if this person really had something credible, why in the world would they put it on YouTube instead of taking it to a local university or some scientist to examine? But then I had to finally acknowledge that I'm not of that generation. This generation, that is how they communicate. They don't see that as necessarily a diminishing aspect of communicating by putting it on Facebook or putting it on YouTube. That's just how they get their message out.
They do, yeah.
I had to take that into account but having said that, there also is a lot of pranking, a lot of silliness that gets posted on those social media, and we're laboring under that unfortunate circumstance that the first question you have to ask is not, what scientific observations can be made, but is this even reliable data upon which to base observations?
Yeah. Would you say that probably a great much of it is sort of unreliable sort of data?
I would, yes.
Yeah.
You really have to work hard to winnow through the chaff, and some of that is intentional, and some of it, but I think even more, is unintentional. In other words, there are a lot of enthusiasts who see what they hope want
to see. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I get a regular stream of pictures of potential footprints, for example, that are in many cases, anything but footprints. They're just melted out divots in the snow. They're mud puddles that bear a slight resemblance. They're mistaken footprints, ambiguous footprints of other things like bears. It's a real common source because of its flat hind foot and 5 toes in contact with the ground. And likewise with photographs, people, that principle of pareidolia, where we see something in random patterns that emerges as something recognizable. And like seeing Elvis in a piece of toast. People see things in shadows. They see things in tree trunks. They see things in the pattern of leaves and foliage. And you have to. I used to be a lot more diplomatic and display a lot of détente. I'm a little more to the point. A little more curt with people at this stage, because time is such a luxury. You become much more aware of the sands slipping through the hourglass.
Absolutely.
There's a time to mess around with superfluous.
Yeah. Could I just follow on? I'm sorry, Daniel. I'll let you in a second.
That's all right.
If I just follow up from that, Dr. Meldrum, where you mentioned about the perhaps we haven't got more photographic evidence because of the population of the Sasquatch. What is your opinion on the sort of minimum viable population of a Sasquatch to actually sustain a healthy species? And do you think there are different maybe subspecies within the sort of species as a whole, but particularly perhaps thinking about in the Pacific Northwest, where the wilderness is sort of vast. Where I'm leading to is there have been some reported sightings within the UK. We don't have that wilderness here. So I'm trying to think with the limited wilderness we've got, what is your opinion on whether a sustainable population could exist in a smaller area? Do you understand where I'm coming from?
I do. Oh, most certainly. I'm expecting that at some point. Yes. Well, as I said, I think that they are very, very rare. As a large-bodied hominoid, member of the ape family, ape and or human, we're members of the hominoidea as well. They're the parameters of their natural history, their longevity, their developmental trajectory, their age of maturation, the interbirth interval, the frequency of reproduction.
Yeah.
All those things point to a creature or a population that requires or that has fewer individuals than something like deer, for example.
Yeah.
And so what I have tried to do to try to get a handle, and it's interesting how things have converged. First, let me visit the notion of what is a minimum viable population. If you do some research, that concept is actually pretty nebulous, and the basis for viability rests upon the health of the gene pool, not just the size and the diversity, but how many harmful mutations, recessive mutations, lurk in that gene pool. And it's with inbreeding, with crossing with very close relatives, that the chances of homozygous recessive mutations cropping up that are harmful to the population.
Yep.
Now, if the gene pool is pretty healthy, with few accumulated recessive genes, then the population can actually tolerate inbreeding to a much greater degree than a species in which there is quite a level of recessive mutations. The only way to ascertain that is through extensive sampling in the field and in the laboratory. And so it's problematic to pin a number on any particular species without that kind of research. So if you Google minimum viable population, I think it's in Wikipedia, there's a fairly good little write-up, but it offers that based on a perusal of literature, that a reasonable number for a vertebrate species is about 1,000 individuals.
Right, that's really interesting.
At 500 to 1,000. Well, vertebrate species, that's everything from a newt to an elephant.
To an elephant, yeah.
So that's a very generic kind of ambiguous statement to be made. But if that's a ballpark, let's just run with that. So what I have sometimes done in public presentations, I haven't written this up yet, but it's because it's just kind of an exercise to create a straw man or an approximation. But in order to have a notion, we have to have a few assumptions, and those can be based on some evidence. So, for example, I think it's safe to assume that Sasquatch are relatively solitary. Almost all footprint finds and encounter reports, visual encounters, are of single individuals, or sometimes, on rare occasions, what we take to be females, based on the size and proportion of the footprint, and with infants in company. And we have documented cases of that, with little footprints trailing alongside, the Bigfoot, middle-sized footprints, the mama footprints. And so that would translate, if we looked for analogy to the as far as social structure amongst the great apes, the best comparison would be to an orangutan. Now, bearing in mind that the living great apes are themselves relic populations of a once more widespread and diverse radiation of apes. There are over 100 known extinct species of ape now. We have 4 or 5, depending on how you slice the cake, and they are endangered. They're on the brink of extinction. They're limited to tropical refugia, whereas at one time apes were quite diverse in their habitat and diet and locomotor adaptations. So, but given that working context right now, an orangutan exhibits what's called a noyu. The male, rather than, say, as in a gorilla, which dominates several females in a harem and has exclusive reproductive access to them, the orangutan advertises his presence in a given piece of real estate. And so you get these loud, raucous calls where the male dominates his size and strength in his neighborhood, which happens to overlap that of several females who when they are receptive to the male's attentions, will seek him out. They want to procreate with the biggest, baddest guy on the block, because that reflects healthy genes and a better chance of their offspring being successful. So anyway, if we translate that to Sasquatch, then we've got a three-dimensional niche space in a large high canopy tropical forest to a temperate forest where the resources are on the ground or underground. Very little resources are up in the canopy, so the area is probably pretty large. And without going into all the details, we put that at about 1,000 square miles, just for the sake of conversation. So 33 miles, 36 miles, about 36 miles, roughly. And that's based on some evidence. It's not just plucked out of the air. So then you look at other factors. There's been estimates of good correlation between rainfall levels and credible reports of Sasquatch. That makes sense. You have to have a certain precipitation level to support a productive temperate forest that would support a large omnivore. Well, there is another large omnivore, right? Bears. So actually it turns out, and there's a published report that shows a remarkable correlation between the distribution of black bear habitat and credible, and when I say credible, I mean, as credible as they can be, or corroborated with footprints and so forth, or hair and so on, and Sasquatch. So not surprising. So that gives us a tool. We can look at a distribution map of black bear across North America, and that will highlight areas that would possibly support a Sasquatch population. And there seems to be good, we don't have credible reports. We have reports sometimes, but not real credible reports of Sasquatch in the wheat fields of Kansas or the cornfields of Iowa, or Indiana. We do have it up throughout the Pacific Northwest, throughout the Rocky Mountains, across the boreal forests of Canada, down back through the Appalachia into the deep south, and kind of hooks up there to the Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Four Corners area. We can also kind of gauge the potential for population in those areas by looking at the density of the bear population. So, for example, in Idaho, there's an estimated 35,000 black bear. In British Columbia, there's 110,000 black bear. But if you go over to one of the eastern states, like Georgia, it's maybe between 2,000 or 3,000. I can't keep all those numbers straight, so don't hold me to that. But it drops off considerably. And then, of course, you go into some place like Kansas, and it's zero. So it would so if we, one more link in the chain there. If we take that available habitat, bearing in mind its productivity, and then try to fit in habit or a possible home range, how many? Just make a circle. How many circles of about 1,000 square mile area can we fit into the available habitat? And it's just a rough approximation. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of variation in the topography and patchiness of the habitat. It's not uniform, not homogeneous, and different levels of development and incursions, roads and logging and mining and resource harvesting and so forth, so forth. Anyway, so in Idaho, I come up with a number on the order of about 150 to maybe possibly 300. It's about 100 to 200 black bear per Sasquatch.
Per Sasquatch, yeah.
And it's interesting because I came up with this kind of independently, this model, and then I was reviewing Dr. Grover Krantz's text, and he had suggested that his gut estimate was about 100 black bear per one Sasquatch. It was spot on, so it was quite interesting.
It is
now,
interesting. Yeah.
As for the UK, it's not only a matter of the habitat, but it's kind of also the biogeography. I mean, because Sasquatch, in my estimation, is a biological species. It's not paranormal. It's not, a mythological entity that is detached from the parameters of living species and their within their habitat, their natural history. So an ape in North America, I mean, one of the objections has been, well, how could there be an ape in North America? Well, really easy. There were lots and lots of apes in Eurasia throughout from the Pliocene through mid-Pleistocene, the Miocene rather, through the mid-Pleistocene. And many people are unaware that 75% of the species of mammals in North America came to this continent from Eurasia, came across that Bering Land Bridge. So that makes sense. But the other direction, now, yes, there were apes. There were Dryopithecine apes during the Miocene in Europe, but during through the Pleistocene, much of the UK was under ice.
Yes.
And there's only recently been habitat there that has been taken advantage of by our immediate ancestors, but there isn't really a biogeographical argument that could be made for the existence of a giant bipedal ape in the UK. And that whole phenomenon, I've been around. I didn't just fall off the turnip wagon here yesterday. And around long enough to have seen the blossoming of the lore surrounding the possibility of Bigfoot in the UK. This hasn't been a long-standing. I mean, at least I'm not aware of, nor have I seen anyone produce the folklore and legends and historical stories of encounters with, and I may be completely wrong, but with Sasquatch-like entities in the UK. It seems to be a much more recent vintage as the popularity grew in the States. Then it seemed to have, the feathers blew across the pond to the plants, or started tickling the imaginations of some people over there.
I totally agree with that. Yeah, I think it's more likely to be an imagination of thinking, well, that they've got them, then we should have them as well, than this sort of thing. But anyway, that's so interesting, Dr. Meldrum. I feel I've sort of monopolized you a little bit, and seeing as this was my grandson's Daniel's sort of podcast, I'd leave it up to him now to get some words in. But thank you ever so much again, Dr. Meldrum, for all of that.
Very interesting.
Okay, Daniel, over to you.
Dr. Meldrum, listening to all of that sent a shiver down my spine. All that was incredible to listen to. When you started off with that first story, when you found those series of footprints, I got goosebumps on my arm because I was so wow about that, and I before we go over, but I really appreciate you being on this podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So have you had any experiences or sightings to do with Bigfoot?
Possibly. I've had some interesting encounters. In my book, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, I kind of open with an experience that occurred on one of my first field excursions, expeditions, if you will, if that name doesn't carry the wrong stigma, that term. But we were in Northern California. We were actually just over the ridge in the adjacent drainage from Bluff Creek, where the Patterson-Gimlin film was shot. And we were in the headwaters of the Blue Creek, which is just over the ridge. But in any case, we had something come into camp and attempt to pilfer food, and also kind of investigated our tents. In one instance, it ran its fingertips along the rain fly of my tent, and
Wow.
jostled the pole, the hoop pole in the tent, and left 16-inch footprints in the grass and in impressions in the bog, the swamp, or not swamp, marshy soil next to a spring that we were camped beside. And so the footprints were indistinct. They filled back in with water, but they were it was quite interesting. I've had vocalizations. I've seen footprints. I did catch a glimpse, I think, of one just a couple of years ago. I was up in Canada, the guest of an investigator up there, and we had something again, visit camp. Late in the wee hours of the morning, we would routinely stay up quite late after our day of hiking and investigation. But then as darkness overtook, we would keep a fire going and just carrying on conversation, cooking things, trying to attract attention. And sure enough, it seems something took note and approached camp. It was just outside the firelight. I had a night vision monocular. I was trying to catch a glimpse, and eventually it broke from cover to cross the road that we were camped on. We were at the end of a road that was bermed, blocking it off, and so beyond the berm, it broke from the shadows and crossed the stretch of the road to the opposite side. And it wasn't great conditions. It was very low ambient light. The moon was not up, and the stars were about all the available light, with the exception of the firelight, which tended to more illuminate just things that were close in, almost swamp out the effect. But if you imagine Patty on the Patterson-Gimlin film in complete silhouette, just blacked out, walking, in this case the other direction, but across the kind of grayish, lighter gravel base of the roadbed, before she disappeared into the bushes, into the tree line, shadowed tree line on the opposite side. That's kind of what I caught a glimpse of. She was also obscured up to about mid-thigh by the intervening berm, brightly illuminated by the fire. And I wasn't certain of what I saw. I was a little, and I almost didn't say anything because I didn't want others to read into it. But the next day, Dr. Bindernagel was there in attendance as well. He and our host, Todd Standing, were able to identify where it had walked. And not clear footprints, but vegetation. And once he had established where he was confident that it had walked, they filmed John walk that line, and from the vantage point my point of observation, and it was spot on, it seemed. So it kind of confirmed to me that, yeah, I did see something actually walk up that slope and across the road from the shadows. So that's the extent of it. I haven't had the privilege of a daylight eye-to-eye contact. I'm hoping for that sometime, although unfortunately I'm not able to get out into the field as often as I used to.
And yeah, I hope as well that I get that Class A sighting as well. And you talking about the expeditions, we here in the UK have only just started thinking about the expeditions. We've done a few in the forest to kind of investigate whether Bigfoot does or does not exist here. Obviously, I'm quite skeptical whether he or it does live here, because of the amount of forest that we have here. We don't have miles and miles like you guys do,
right?
So that's something that I'm looking into right now.
Right. See, and what would be interesting as you pursue that, for me, the standard always has been and will be the experiences need to be corroborated with trace and physical evidence. That is, footprints, scat, hair, so that you're not reliant entirely upon the powers of observation of a witness that may have other motivations, other preconceptions. Now, in your case there in the UK, see, it would be much more likely, in my opinion, than a Sasquatch, of the dimensions of a Sasquatch, and given the biogeography we were talking about, a more interesting and more probable scenario would be some other form of relic hominoid, like a Neanderthal, something. Now, the only thing about, I mean, the Russian Almas is a great case where they have found recent, it seems, archaeological remains of the existence of pockets of Neanderthals, which had a distribution that encompasses the areas that Almas are currently reported to reside in. And, the UK is not out of the question for such lingering pockets. But again, you got to find that corroborative evidence to substantiate it.
And the thing that gets me is that some people in the UK have said that they've seen this bipedal creature, and that gets me thinking, like, do we have a type of this creature here
Right.
that we haven't got that evidence yet, because we don't have people out looking for this creature in the UK, which is why me and some other people have started thinking, well, these people must have seen something.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's true. And I must say, I tend to be a lumper rather than a splitter. That is, I'm reluctant to acknowledge the probability of multiple types, multiple forms. I mean, I could see something like a Sasquatch that has a circum-Pacific distribution that may extend as far west as the Caucasus Mountains across Asia. I can see something like the Russian Almas, a relic Neanderthal or Denisovan or something of that ilk. I can see although there's the evidence is actually remarkably thin when you winnow out all the chaff for the Yeti. What evidence does exist suggests it has a divergent big toe like other great apes. And so its bipedalism may largely be constrained by those times it's walking through snow. I've witnessed gorillas in the zoo here in Salt Lake who have to endure snowy winters. And many of them, I've seen them, they don't like to put their hands in the cold snow, and they'll walk bipedally, religiously across the enclosure to prevent putting their hands in the snow. And then you have the little forms, the orang pendek, which I think are Australopithecines. I think Homo floresiensis, I think we're justified in connecting the dots between things like the orang pendek, the Endutu, the Ibugogo, and Homo floresiensis. But there's 4, but there could be more. Our comprehension of the hominoid bush, family tree rather, is very bushy, and more branches are added, not annually, but almost annually, it seems, to where there's indications that we've just kind of scratched the surface on the diversity, the taxonomic diversity within that bushy tree, and repeatedly new examples of some of those branches persisting alongside our species until remarkably recently, if not into the present. So you never say never. I don't want to give the impression that I'm as close-minded as those who refuse to acknowledge the possibility of Sasquatch. But
and I think some of the people in the UK have seen the Patterson-Gimlin film and gone, well, okay, and possibly then gone and looked and seen this creature,
Sure.
which is what we're gonna try our very, very best to try and see what's out there.
Yeah.
Because we also have another legend here in the UK called the Exmoor Beast, which is basically a cat, a big cat, and that would increase our thoughts if we found evidence of that big cat. It would put a bit more research into Bigfoot, because it's a predator, whether Bigfoot is as well. So it's similar. So that's what we're gonna try and see in the UK.
Interesting.
So my last two questions for you is: are there any other things that you investigate or have an interest in?
Well, I find that I don't have the luxury of time and resources to chase after too many interests with into the depth or with the thoroughness that I would like to. Certainly, for me, the question of the existence of Sasquatch basically dovetailed with my research interest, my professional research interests into the evolution of hominin bipedalism, because it provides a remarkable comparison, natural comparison contrast with our own condition. I think it's helped me to better interpret evidence and examples of, like, for example, fossilized footprints. I was the first to really draw attention, still haven't convinced everyone, in fact, to features of a mid-tarsal pressure ridge in the Laetoli hominin footprints, which had been completely overlooked even by myself until after I had engaged with the Sasquatch footprints. And then I was asking this question: so is a flat, flexible foot, is that something that distinguishes Sasquatch from all hominin ancestors, or is that something that represents a primitive condition? It turns out, and now the consensus largely is, even if my interpretation of specific features of the footprints hasn't been generally accepted by all, it is acknowledged that early hominins did walk on flat, flexible feet, that arches are a fairly recent innovation in human evolution. So, but I tell you, I'm interested. I was interested in all aspects of kind of cryptozoology. It's so diverse that I've pretty much kind of pulled in the stakes and concentrated on just the mystery primates. But I try to keep my fingers on the pulse of other things. The recent developments and governmental acknowledgement of UAPs is fascinating to me, and opens up all kinds of curious. I don't make any connections to Sasquatch, despite what some people have advocated, but I think they're two completely separate subject matter. But yeah.
And I think it's a really good idea to focus on one thing, because you might actually get more out of it, so you're focused on one thing.
Right.
So my last question for you is: how can our listeners follow your fascinating work?
Right. Well, if they're not already familiar with my book, which is the is really, I think, an important springboard for anyone who wants to understand a scientific approach to the subject matter. I would recommend that, Sasquatch Legend Meets Science. We're actually poised, Doug Hychek, the producer of the documentary that was the inspiration for that book, is doing a sequel, a part 2 now, sort of an updated, expanded revision of the first. What evidences have accumulated in the past 25 years now. And so I'll be writing a companion volume for that production as well. Otherwise, I would also point them to the online journal, which I edit along with a editorial board of PhDs and other professionals. It's entitled The Relic Hominoid Inquiry, the RHI for short, and it can be easily Googled, or if you go to www.isu.edu/RHI. We're in our 12th year now. It's a peer-reviewed, a registered peer-reviewed journal. It contains research articles, field reports, in-depth book reviews, essays, news items, commentary. It's a really good, and lots of, we've also included lots of translated historical manuscripts or monographs that are of significance, so that the English, the Anglophone audience can now read them. So it's a great way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of newer developments, or get input about the quality of some of the publications which seem to proliferate. We sort of focus in on those that are more academically inclined, and that would be a great place to get some excellent additional information on the subject, reliable information.
So, Dr. Meldrum, I would really like to say thank you very, very much for joining us, and I really, really appreciate it. And I know podcast partners Adrian Roberts and Craig Barnett would really, really appreciate that as well.
Absolutely fascinating conversation, Dr. Meldrum. You know, I haven't said much because I've just been in awe, really, of your stories and your knowledge. And thank you for giving up your time to Daniel. I know it's this a bit of a dream come true for him really to be able to talk to you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. It's always great to expand the audience a little bit and share with others who share a common interest. So thanks again.
Amazing, and I would love to have you on again if
certainly
if we ever can organise it. But thank you very, very much, Dr. Meldrum.
You're quite welcome. Thank you, and I'd love to
Amazing.
come on again. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, guys, I will see you in the next podcast. Bye.
Yeah, thank you so much.